72 years of a clean life, and this is how my own blood rewards me. I came home to find my late husband's urn tossed in a junk box with old magazines like an afterthought. My son Sam and his wife had moved in, claiming I was too forgetful to live alone. Sam showed me a forged deed, his eyes filled with greed for the house he'd stolen to pay his debts. He thought he'd broken me, but he forgot who taught him how to play the game. Listen to the end to hear how I reclaimed my home, and subscribe for more. The cardboard box sat on my porch like an insult wrapped in brown tape. I had been gone 3 days. 3 days at the Serenity Springs Resort outside Marietta, hot stone massage, mineral pools, and a woman named Deb who talked too much about her grandchildren. 3 days away from this house, this library, this life I'd built over half a century in Buckhead. And now I stood at the foot of my own limestone steps, my weekend bag dropped somewhere behind me, staring at the word junk scrawled in black Sharpie across the side of a cardboard box that had been placed, left, on my freshly swept porch like something a careless moving crew forgets to load. The Georgia humidity hit me the moment I stepped out of the cab. August in Atlanta has a way of pressing down on you, heavy and wet, like the air itself is grieving. My hands ached the way they always do in the heat, the swollen knuckles of my right hand throbbing as I bent to pull at the tape. I was thinking mail. Old utility statements, maybe the upholstery samples from the window treatment project I'd put off all spring. My fingers found the urn. The brass was cool against my palms, the temperature of a basement, of something that had been moved and set down and forgotten. I recognized it immediately, the weight, the tarnished patina, the small engraved plate I had chosen myself at the funeral parlor on Peachtree Road. Judge Harold Thornton. Beloved. I had kept it on the center shelf of the library, between the complete Georgia Law Review and the 1954 edition of Blackstone's Commentaries, the two things Harold had loved nearly as much as he'd loved me. My husband. 30 years on the Superior Court bench. Carried out with the recycling. The humid air turned sharp in my lungs. I pressed the urn to my chest. It was heavier than I remembered, heavier than anything in that moment, and I stood there on my own front porch, in the August heat, and understood that something had happened to my home that could not be undone by a simple phone call. My hands shook. Not from the arthritis, though the joints were screaming, a low, familiar fire that ran from my knuckles up to my wrists. They shook from something older and colder than pain. I wrapped both arms around the urn and held it the way you hold something you've nearly lost, pressing the gritty metal against my sternum as if I could will warmth back into it. Harold had been on that shelf for 4 years. 4 years of Sunday mornings when I'd pour myself a small glass of sherry and sit in the wingback chair and talk to him the way I'd talked to him in life, about the news, about the neighbors, about the books I was reading. He'd been my interlocutor in absentia, the silent anchor of the only room in this house I considered truly mine. They had moved him before they moved in. That detail lodged in me like a splinter. Not an oversight. A statement. The grit of the porch floor ground under my loafers as I straightened. I smoothed my wool trousers with one hand, tucking the urn under my left arm. My Cartier watch read 11:43. The cab had already gone. The street was quiet, the magnolias rustling in the driveway with that soft, indifferent sigh they have in late summer. I walked to the front door and turned the handle. The smell hit me first. My home has a scent. It's not something I ever chose, it's something it simply became over the decades. Waxed oak floors. Dried hydrangeas from the garden. A faint trace of leather from Harold's law books. The faintest ghost of the cedar closets on the upper landing. It is the smell of continuity, of a life carefully maintained. That smell was gone. In its place, burnt toast. Something chemical and sweet, lily of the valley, the synthetic kind that comes in a bottle shaped like a flower and costs $11 at a drugstore. And underneath it all, something stale and human, the smell of someone else's habit saturating spaces they had no right to occupy. She was on the Louis XIV settee. Candace. Barefoot, legs crossed at the ankle, swinging one foot with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who knows you're watching and doesn't care. She was wearing my pale blue silk robe, my robe, the one I'd had laundered twice a year and kept in the cedar closet wrapped in tissue paper, and her toenails were painted the color of emergency cones. A juice glass sat in her hand. My sherry. The 1945. The bottle Harold's colleague had sent from a Bordeaux estate the year we were married, the bottle I had kept because drinking it had always felt like too large a statement to make alone. She was using it to wash down whatever she'd been watching on her phone. She looked up when I entered. No surprise. No guilt. Just that slow, reptilian blink, taking stock, assessing, finding me unremarkable. "You're early, Martha," she said. Her voice had the quality of a nail being dragged along a chalkboard, that flat, nasal rasp that had grated on me since the first Thanksgiving she'd attended, 9 years ago, when she'd criticized the cornbread dressing and asked if we could do something more modern next year. I had smiled then. I had refined myself through decades of faculty meetings and library board politics and HOA disputes and the quiet, bloodless warfare of Southern society, and I had smiled. I did not smile now. Change of plans. She swirled the juice glass, and a drop of amber sherry arced out and landed on the silk of my robe sleeve. She didn't flinch. Didn't apologize. "The house is under new management. We've already started sorting through the clutter." She glanced at the urn in my arms, not with apology, not even with the decency of discomfort. The look she gave it was the look a pawnshop broker gives a piece of jewelry he already knows the worth of. My fingers tightened on the brass. The silence in the foyer swelled between us, high-ceilinged and cold. "Get out of my house, Candace," I said. I kept my voice low and even, the voice I had learned from Harold, the courtroom voice, the one that didn't need to rise to carry authority. I took a step forward, using the urn as a kind of anchor, a reminder to myself of what was at stake. "Get out. Now." Sam stepped out of the dining room. I had been watching the wrong door. He came from the shadows near the hutch, and for a half-second I saw the boy I'd taught to play bridge at that same dining table, the round-faced, restless boy who could never sit still long enough to learn patience. That boy was gone. What stood in front of me was a man I only half recognized, 48 years old, soft around the middle in a way that spoke of stress and irregular meals, wearing a wrinkled polo shirt the color of old grass. His thinning brown hair was slicked back with too much product, a compensatory grooming, the kind men do when they know they're losing ground. His brown eyes moved too quickly, darting from me to Candace and back, calibrating. He didn't hug me. He didn't say welcome home or how was your trip. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The crack it made when he snapped it open, sharp, deliberate, almost theatrical, raised every hair on the back of my neck. He held the paper inches from my face. A photocopy of a quitclaim deed. The formatting was correct, the notary block was present, the legal description of the property ran down the left margin in the standard courthouse format I had read on 100 documents in Harold's library over 30 years. And there, at the bottom, in the elegant copperplate cursive I had spent my life perfecting, the hand I'd used to write letters to senators and thank-you notes on cream card stock and every Christmas card for 40 years. My signature. "You signed the house over to the trust, Mom," Sam said. His voice had shed its usual performative warmth entirely. The Southern gentleman register he deployed at parties and in front of my friends was simply absent, as though he hadn't bothered to pack it for this particular occasion. "Everything is legal. Recorded at the courthouse yesterday while you were getting your mud bath." I stared at my own handwriting and felt the room tilt slightly. My signature. My copperplate signature. The loops of the M, the long descender on the H, but the pressure was wrong, the slant was wrong, and the A in Martha had been written with a printed baseline that I had never used in my life. I had been forging my own signature in my head every morning for 50 years. I knew every curve of it the way a musician knows a chord by feel, not sight. This was a very good forgery. But it was a forgery. I never signed this, Sam, I said, and my voice came out quieter than I intended, barely above a whisper. This is a felony. He sighed. It was a practiced sound, long and patient and weighted with theatrical regret, the sigh of a man performing concern for an audience of one. He stepped closer, and his shadow moved over mine on the foyer floor. See? This is exactly what the doctor was worried about. His voice had slipped back into something resembling tenderness, the slimy, counterfeit kind. You're getting forgetful, Martha. Drifting. The incident with the stove last spring, the confusion at the HOA meeting, he shook his head. We're moving in to take care of you because you clearly can't manage the estate anymore. He reached out and placed his hand on my shoulder. The weight of it was not the weight of comfort. It was the weight of a decision that had already been made, a lid being pressed down on something that was still alive. I looked at his wrist. The watch. I'd bought him a Patek Philippe for his 40th birthday. What caught my light now was a replica. A good one, but I had handled enough fine things in my life to recognize the difference between substance and mimicry. I had been paying attention for 48 years and I had, somehow, not been paying attention at all. The twitching eyelid. The replica watch. The forged deed filed at the courthouse the day I was gone, pre-planned, precisely timed. I did the arithmetic and it settled in me like sediment, the crypto bleed. I had heard the term from Carol Whitmore at the Bridge Club 2 years ago. Her nephew had lost $400,000 to a digital currency scheme that had collapsed like a sandcastle in a rainstorm. Sam had been invested in something similar. I'd known that much. I had not known the scale of the damage. But I saw it now in the frantic stillness of him, in the way his jaw was set too tight, in the very fact that he had done this today instead of continuing to ask me for loans that I had quietly been refusing for 3 years. He wasn't moving in to care for me. He was liquidating me. The house, the Buckhead Estate Herald and I had bought in 1981, the property I had paid taxes on and maintained and loved for 43 years, had become a collateral item. A line on a ledger. And I, apparently, had become a liability. The cold stone settled in my stomach, heavy and utterly permanent. His hand was still on my shoulder. I stepped sideways, moving toward the mahogany console table by the door, the one where the landline had sat for 20 years, where I kept the notepad and the address book and where I had, in 30 years of marriage, called Harold from when he was working late because I wanted him home. I needed the sheriff's non-emergency line. I needed to speak to someone outside these walls. I reached for the receiver. Sam's hand came down like a hammer. Not on me, on the phone. His palm slapped the hook with a force that rattled the crystal vase on the table, a sharp percussive crack that silenced the dial tone before it had fully started. The vase rocked. I caught it with one hand, purely on reflex, my arthritic fingers screaming at the sudden grip. He was no longer performing anything. His fingers closed around my wrist. Not a grasp, a lock. The 4 fingers wrapped around the thin skin above my pulse point and the thumb pressed in, directly on the joint, directly on the place where the arthritis was worst, the place where on bad mornings I couldn't hold a pen without wincing. The pain was immediate and specific and intimate in the way that only pain from someone who knows your body can be. Don't make this difficult, Mom, he said. He bent toward me, close enough that I could smell the stale coffee on his breath, the sourness of someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. We can do this easily or we can do this the hard way. That's the only choice you have right now. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. The pain was real, the joint was singing, a high, bright note of protest. But I had endured osteoarthritis for 11 years and I had long since learned to regard pain as information, not instruction. I looked at my son's hand on my wrist and I understood that whatever remained of my maternal grief was a luxury I could no longer afford. I made myself look at his eyes. I searched them the way I used to search a legal brief for the argument that mattered, methodically, without sentiment. Brown eyes, bloodshot at the edges. The pupils slightly too dilated for the foyer light. The flat, glassy quality of a man who has moved past doubt into the merciful numbness of commitment. He had decided before he came here. He had probably decided weeks ago. The deed at the courthouse was the proof, recorded yesterday, he'd said, which meant the forgery had been prepared well in advance, which meant this was not impulse or desperation but planning. Desperate men plan. That was the thing people forgot. Desperation doesn't preclude calculation, it often accelerates it. There was nothing in those eyes that I could appeal to. No latent guilt, no buried filial loyalty that a well-chosen word might pry open. The boy who had sat across from me at the bridge table, the boy I had taught to hold his cards close and read the room, that boy had learned those lessons and used them against me, and he was gone. What I had in front of me was a man who would break my wrist if I gave him sufficient reason. I stopped looking for my son. I started looking for his weaknesses. I let my body go. It is a thing I learned not from any book or any training. I learned it from years of observing Harold in court, watching how he handled hostile witnesses. The moment you stop resisting, you stop providing information. I let the tension drain out of my arm, let my shoulder drop, let my posture soften from the steel spine I normally carried into something that suggested frailty, confusion, the papery fragility of a woman who had simply been overwhelmed. Sam's grip loosened. Just slightly. Just enough. I'm just tired, Sam, I murmured. I dropped my chin, letting a strand of my silver-white bob fall forward over one eye. Behind it, hidden behind the mild flutter of my lashes and the careful, convincing tremor of my lower lip, my mind was absolutely clear. Cleaner, perhaps, than it had been in years. I felt the shift in him. The easing of his shoulders. The small, ugly flicker of triumph that crossed his face when he believed he had reduced me to compliance. He thought the old woman had surrendered. He did not know that I had just made my first move. I counted, steadily and silently, the cards I still held, the floor safe in the library, hidden under the Persian rug beneath Harold's desk. The original deed, filed under my maiden name, Martha Elaine Corley, not Thornton. The specific clause Harold had insisted on drafting himself, the one his law clerk had thought was paranoid and old-fashioned and which I had defended because Harold had never done anything without a reason. The decades of bridge, the years of sleight of hand, the 1,000 small deceptions that constitute a lifetime of navigating a world that has always underestimated women who look like me. I adjusted my grip on the urn, Harold, still pressed to my chest, and I thought, they do not know what game they are playing. I did. Hand it over, Mother. For your own protection. He said it with that particular vocal softness men use when they've decided to be gentle about taking something from you, the register of a hospital orderly, or a mugger who prefers not to make a scene. His fingers were already reaching for the leather strap of my bag before the sentence was finished. I held on. I want that on record. My arthritic hands, swollen and screaming from everything the last 20 minutes had already done to them, closed on that strap and held. My bag contained my phone, my wallet, my silver bridge card case that had been my mother's, and it contained the small, essential proof that I was a person with connections to the world outside these walls. I held on with everything I had. It wasn't enough. Sam's grip was the grip of a man who has already lost everything he cared about losing and is now down to the animal mechanics of survival. He wrenched sideways, and the strap gave way, and the contents of the bag scattered across the Persian rug in the library like evidence at a crime scene, the compact, the card case, 3 receipts from the Serenity Springs gift shop, and my iPhone face down against the fringe. He scooped the phone without hesitating and slid it into his pocket. The compact and the card case he left on the floor. The internet is a playground for predators, he said, already moving toward the door. Until your mind clears, you don't need the distraction. I looked at my mother's silver bridge card case on the rug. Then I looked at the closed library door. Then I pressed the urn to my chest and reminded myself that I had been in tighter corners at the bridge table. The difference was that at the bridge table, I had never been the one with no cards. Not yet, I thought. Not yet. They left me alone long enough for the first hour to pass. I know because the grandfather clock in the foyer still worked, and its quarterly chime was the only thing in the house that hadn't been touched yet. I moved to the library window, walking carefully, using the bookshelf as a rail, performing the slow deliberate shuffle of a woman whose joints were giving her trouble, which was true enough, though the degree of shuffling was somewhat theatrical. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass and looked out into the August afternoon. Sam was at the side of the house. He had a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters, the yellow-handled kind you buy at a hardware store, the kind intended for fencing and chain link. He was working at the junction box on the exterior wall, and I watched him with the strange, dissociative calm of a person watching something terrible happen to someone else's life. He found the line. He positioned the cutters. He looked, briefly, toward the street, a reflex check. The guilty glance of a man who knows what he's doing is visible, and then he snipped. The telephone line dropped into the mulch bed below like something that had simply given up. From somewhere in the hallway, the router emitted a small, wounded series of beeps and went silent. He didn't look at the window. He didn't look at me. He brushed the dirt from his hands against his polo shirt and walked back toward the rear of the property with the wire cutters hanging from one hand, and the Buckhead's sun caught the yellow handles and made them look almost cheerful. The neighbor's sprinklers hissed across the street. A mockingbird ran through its catalog somewhere in the magnolias. The world continued, indifferent and bright, and inside my house the 21st century had been surgically removed. I was 72 years old, standing in my own library with a brass urn under my arm and no connection to the outside world, and I was being managed. I turned away from the window and began to think. They established the morning routine within 48 hours, with the cheerful efficiency of people who have planned something thoroughly. At 8 o'clock on the second morning, I heard Candace's footsteps in the hall, a particular rhythm I was already learning to dread, the sharp decisive click of someone on a mission. The cheap lily perfume arrived 30 seconds before she did. The door opened without a knock. "Vitamin time, Martha," she announced. Her voice had the pitched brightness of a preschool teacher or a pharmaceutical commercial, warm on the surface, with absolutely nothing underneath. She was holding a plastic medicine cup in one hand and a glass of lukewarm tap water in the other, and she crossed the room to my bedside and set them down with the practiced efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this. Inside the cup, 3 capsules. 2 neon blue, 1 thick and yellow. I had been a librarian for 31 years, and before that a librarian's assistant, and before that a woman who had spent decades maintaining a superior court judge's professional library. I had read medical reference materials the way other women read paperbacks. I recognized benzodiazepine blue. I looked at the capsules. Candace watched me look at the capsules. Her arms were crossed at her waist, her weight shifted onto one hip, her eyes tracking my hands the way a hawk tracks something small moving in tall grass. "Take your time," she said, which meant, "I am not leaving until I watch you swallow." I picked up the cup. I want to be precise about what happened next, because precision is the whole point. Over 40 years of competitive bridge, not social bridge, not the friendly Friday afternoon variety, but the tournament circuit, the regional and national levels, the kind where a false card played at the wrong moment costs you a game, I had developed what my partner Denise always called, the hands. Not quick hands. Deliberate hands. Hands that could perform a specific mechanical action in the foreground while the audience's attention was engaged elsewhere. The move is called the second dealer's slip. In card mechanics, it refers to palming a card against the pad of the lower fingers while the action of dealing or receiving appears entirely normal. I had adapted it years ago for a parlor trick that delighted Harold's colleagues at their annual summer party. The principal transfers. As the rim of the glass met my lower lip and I tipped my head back, my tongue moved. The capsules, 2 blue, 1 yellow, tucked themselves against the back of my lower molars, in the pocket between tooth and cheek, while the water flowed in around them and I swallowed with the full theatrical conviction of a woman with nothing to hide. I even produced the audible gulp, the wet, decisive sound of compliance. Candace uncrossed her arms slightly. "Open," she said. I opened my mouth and showed her my tongue, turned it to the side. "Empty." She nodded with the satisfaction of someone who has successfully managed a difficult task, and turned to the pillow on the far side of the bed, smoothing it with the proprietary touch of someone who had already decided the room was hers. The moment her back was to me, I leaned toward the large potted parlor palm in the corner, the one I'd had for 11 years, the one Harold had always teased me about because I talked to it, and I pressed the half-dissolved capsules into the dark soil at the base of the trunk, burying them with 2 fingers the way you bury a seed. Then I folded my hands in my lap and gazed at the middle distance with the serene vacancy of a woman in chemical compliance, and waited for her to leave. The sedatives I was not taking did their own kind of work. I learned to read the rhythm of the house through their absence, through the fact that my mind remained mine, sharp and cataloging, while Sam and Candace moved through the rooms with the careless confidence of people who believed they were the only conscious entities present. On the 4th day, I lay on the sunroom's sofa in the early afternoon, eyes 3/4 closed, breathing in the slow cadence that Candace had come to associate with "down for the count." The August light came through the sheer curtains and turned the room pale gold. From the kitchen, voices drifted through the vent above the baseboard, Sam's and Candace's, the sounds of an argument that had been worn smooth from repetition. "The appraisal came in at $2 million, Sam said." His voice through the vent was muffled but distinct, low and pressurized, the voice of a man trying to keep his panic below conversational volume and failing. "If we take the private equity loan, we get $1.5 million up front. We just need her signature on the power of attorney to clear the title. $1.5 million. Against a $2 million property." The numbers had the specific ugliness of something calculated carefully by someone who is very good at spending other people's money. Candace's laugh came through the vent like a knife through foil. "She's a ghost, Sam. Ghosts don't need houses. We'll be in Grand Cayman before the first payment is even due." I lay on the sofa with my eyes mostly closed and my breathing slow and even, and I filed those words in the precise way I had filed 30 years of legal briefs and research requests and reference queries, carefully, completely, without emotional annotation. There would be time for annotation later. $1.5 million. A predatory loan secured against an estate they did not legally own. Grand Cayman. I was not a ghost. I was listening. The social campaign began that same week, and I will tell you honestly that it was the part that hurt most. More than the wrenched bag, more than Sam's grip on my wrist, more than lying on the floor of my library gasping from a pain that had no solution. What Candace did to my name, that was the part that found the seam in the armor. I watched it from behind a cracked door. She was in the sitting room with her phone, and she had arranged her face into something I can only describe as a performance of grief, the slightly crumpled brow, the lower lip pressed, the voice pitched to convey brave endurance in the face of terrible news. She could have been in a commercial for funeral homes. "Oh, Evelyn," she said, and the name hit me like a cold draft. Evelyn Marsh. HOA president. My neighbor, my bridge partner on rotating Thursdays for the better part of 15 years. A woman who had held my hand at Harold's funeral and cried more convincingly than I had allowed myself to. "It's just heartbreaking." She didn't recognize Sam this morning. "The doctors say any stimulation could trigger an episode. We have to keep the house quiet. No visitors for now." A pause. Then the careful application of the killing detail, rapid onset dementia. 3 words. The kind that don't require elaboration in certain circles. The kind that close doors and drop voices and redirect gazes. I pressed my palm flat against the wall and breathed through my nose, measured and slow, and did not make a sound. By the next morning, I had the evidence. Evelyn's morning walk with her miniature poodle, Pearl, a ridiculous name for a dog, but Harold had always liked her, past the front gate at approximately 9:20, as it had every weekday for as long as I could remember. I was at the library window, watching. I had positioned myself at the corner of the frame where I could see the sidewalk without, I hoped, being particularly visible from the street. Evelyn came around the curve by the Whitmore hydrangeas. Pearl was trotting ahead on her lead. Evelyn's eyes moved to the house, the involuntary gaze of a person passing a place they'd been told to worry about, and for 1/2 second, her eyes found mine through the glass. I raised my hand. Palm flat, fingers together. The gesture of a person who is present in herself and desperately, specifically, asking to be seen. The pity moved across Evelyn's face like a weather front, visible, complete, and followed immediately by the deliberate redirection of someone who has been told that engagement is not helpful. She tightened Pearl's leash. She looked back at the sidewalk. She picked up her pace and rounded the corner and was gone. Candace's lie had taken root in the best soil possible, 30 years of genuine neighborly regard, now infected with the specific, paralyzing pity that surrounds a person who is rumored to have lost their mind. I had become a tragedy. And tragedies, in Buckhead, are dealt with by turning away and thanking God it isn't you. I let the curtain fall back and stood in my library for a moment, breathing. Then I went to work on the safe. I moved when the house was at its quietest, the long, suspended silence of mid-afternoon when Sam and Candace retreated to the master wing that had been mine and Harold's for 40 years, now apparently reassigned without ceremony. I gave them 30 minutes past the last sound I could identify. Then I moved. Every inch of the library had to be navigated carefully, not because I was performing frailty but because the frailty was real. My hip had been flaring since the night of my arrival, the physical shock of what had happened to my body during that wrist grab, combined with the cold stress that had settled into my joints the way cold always does when I am frightened, and the floor was uneven in the places I wasn't expecting it. I used the mahogany bookshelves as a rail, my right hand trailing along the leather spines of Harold's law books, the familiar texture of them a small, unbearable comfort. The Persian rug was where it had always been. The pattern, a deep crimson medallion on navy, bought on a trip Harold and I had taken to an estate sale in Savannah in 1987, was unchanged. I knew exactly where the seam of the trapdoor fell under it, knew because Harold had shown me the installation himself, standing in this exact spot with the contractor's paperwork in his hand, explaining the specific legal rider he'd had drafted and why. I reached the rug. I looked down. And my breath left me in a single, involuntary exhale. The desk was from nowhere I recognized. Glass and steel and the specific aggressive modularity of office furniture designed to communicate power without any particular taste, a large executive piece, the kind that comes in a showroom photo with a man in a suit standing behind it looking satisfied with himself. It had been positioned directly over the center of the rug. Not near the rug. Not beside the rug. Over the trapdoor. I stood at the edge of it and ran the geometry in my mind. The desk was, I estimated, a minimum of 250 pounds without the contents of its drawers, which were, I could see, already loaded with Sam's files and equipment. The steel legs were set in a wide, stabilizing stance. Even if I could get under the glass surface and push, I had nothing to push against. He knew about the safe. He hadn't found the code. If he had, the deed would already be gone, but he knew it was there, and he had placed the heaviest thing available in the house directly on top of it with the deliberate, blunt effectiveness of a man who has decided that if he can't have a thing, no one will. I stood there for a long moment and looked at the gleaming steel legs and thought about Harold drafting that clause and thought about 30 years of legal documents and thought about the specific, terrible irony of a man trying to use his father's weight against his father's wishes. Then I dropped to my knees, which was a mistake, because the patellas made their opinion known immediately, sharply and without nuance, and hooked my swollen fingers under the front edge of the desk. I want to describe this accurately, without drama, because what happened was not dramatic. It was simply the specific horror of a body encountering its own limits. I pulled. I pulled with everything in my 130 pounds, with the muscles of my arms and shoulders and back that had been kept relatively functional through years of gardening and the stubborn refusal to stop carrying my own groceries. I pulled with the anger, and there was anger, cold and clean and entirely focused, that had been building since I found the urn in a cardboard box on my own front porch. The desk did not move. The hot, searing line of fire that erupted in my lower back was not a cramp. It was the specific, informative agony of a muscle pushed past its architectural limit. My hands gave way at the wrists, the arthritis making the decision for me, the joints simply unlocking, and I went down onto the rug with a sound I am grateful no one was there to hear. I lay there for a moment, my cheek against the crimson wool, breathing the smell of floor wax and old dust and the faint ghost of the cedar sachets I had always kept in this room. Harold's law books looked down at me from the shelves. The brass urn was on the wingback chair where I'd set it. Everything in this room was mine and not mine, known and unreachable, and I was 72 years old and lying on the floor of my own library because my son had put a desk in my way. The grief was brief. I allowed it 30 seconds. Then I began the problem of getting up. I used the desk drawer handle. It held, the desk, whatever its other qualities, was well bolted. I pulled myself to sitting, then to a 3-point kneel, then, with one final insistence that cost me the remainder of the afternoon's paying budget, to standing. My eyes landed on the legal pad. It was on the upper corner of the desk, half covered by a manila folder, written in Sam's handwriting, the large, looping scrawl that I had watched him develop in 3rd grade and that had never quite matured past a certain adolescent looseness. A yellow legal pad with lines of text. I leaned closer. Liquidation ledger. Item 4, Georgian silver set, EST $4,000. Item 7, dining room china, Wedgwood, full service, $800. Item 12, Judge's Law Library, bulk sale, $500. I turned the page. My grandmother's tea service, the one brought over from Savannah by her mother, the one I had served Harold's colleagues from at every Christmas for 40 years, was listed under miscellaneous, antiques, EST $200, $400. My wedding china was listed under miscellaneous, kitchen. I looked at the numbers. Not the total, I didn't calculate the total was not the point. The point was the $500 figure next to Judge's Law Library. 30 years of Harold's professional life, the books he had annotated in the margins, the volumes he had carried from chambers to home to chambers again, the specific physical record of a man's intellectual life, $500. Bulk sale. The grief dissolved into something else. Something that had a specific temperature, cold, and precise, and very, very clear. The footsteps came from the foyer. Heavy and deliberate, Sam's particular flat-footed stride, vibrating up through the floorboards in a way I had 30 seconds to respond to. Possibly less. I moved. My back objected. My hips objected. My knees, who had already filed a formal complaint, escalated to a grievance. I ignored all of it and covered the distance to the wingback chair in the time I had, collecting the brass urn on the way, and lowered myself into the chair with the specific controlled haste of someone operating on borrowed seconds. The silk robe. I pulled it across my lap, covered the dust smudge on my sleeve, covered the trembling in my legs, covered the evidence of effort. I arranged my hands in my lap and let my gaze soften and go out of focus in the way I had been practicing, the 1,000-yard stare of a mind dissolved in pharmaceutical fog. Slack jaw. Unfocused eyes. Breathing slow and chest level, the breathing of someone who is not cataloging anything. The door opened. Sam stood in the frame for a moment, looking at me the way people look at furniture they're deciding whether to keep or discard. His eyes moved to the desk, checking, I understood immediately, that it hadn't been moved. Then they moved back to me. Then away. He crossed to the desk and opened a file drawer and removed something I didn't try to identify, and left. He never noticed the smudge of dust on the silk at my elbow. He never noticed that the robe was on slightly wrong, that the belt was retied with the left-over right cross instead of my habitual right-over left. He noticed nothing because he was looking at a piece of furniture. I sat in the wingback chair and breathed and stared at the middle distance, and behind the vacant performance of my expression, I turned over everything I had, the liquidation ledger with its specific numbers, Candace's exact words from the kitchen vent, the $1.5 million loan, the Grand Cayman timeline, the desk over the safe, and the grinding, clarifying rage that had replaced what used to be grief. I did not have the deed yet. I did not have communication with the outside world. I did not have my phone or my landline or a neighbor willing to return my gaze. But I had my mind. They had tried to take it and they had not taken it. And I had been playing this game, the game of waiting, of reading the room, of knowing which card to play and precisely when, for longer than Sam had been alive. I heard the car before I saw it. The crunch of gravel on the driveway, a sound the house makes differently depending on who's arriving, a fact I had noted over 40 years of receiving guests, had a particular deliberateness to it. Not the hurried stop of a delivery, not the casual drift of a neighbor. Measured. Official. I was at the library window before I'd consciously decided to move. Black sedan. Government plates. The kind of car that communicates institution without needing to say so. The man who stepped out had a clipboard and the careful, unhurried posture of someone who has learned to make no assumptions in the first 30 seconds. Off-the-rack suit, well-pressed. Mid-40s, I estimated. He stood by the car for a moment and looked at the house the way a person looks at a place they've been told a story about. Adult Protective Services. Officer Vance. My heart was doing something I did not care for, a hard, high staccato against my ribs that I associate with moments when a great deal depends on the next decision and the margin for error is very small. I watched Sam appear in the foyer through the window's reflection, and I watched his hand go to his tie, a reflex adjustment, the grooming instinct of a man preparing to perform. His face shifted. I had seen that shift before, at fundraising dinners and court appearances and every occasion in Sam's life when he needed to be seen as something other than what he was. The morning sun mask. Concerned. Burdened. Doing his level best. I looked at Sam's hands. The same hands that had closed around my wrist with the specific force of a man who had already decided I didn't matter. I thought about what screaming would look like to Officer Vance, arriving to assess a woman her own son had reported as suffering from rapid-onset dementia. I thought about what screaming would confirm. I walked to the wingback chair and sat down. I arranged my hands in my lap. I waited. Vance entered the library with Sam at his shoulder, and I performed the assessment before he finished crossing the threshold, a man doing his job conscientiously, with neither the cynicism of someone who has stopped caring nor the crusading intensity of someone who has an agenda. He was looking at the room, the books, the Persian rug, the windows, the quality of light, with the clinical inventory of a person trained to read environments for evidence of neglect or danger. He was looking for the right things. He was just looking at the wrong story. "Mrs. Thornton," he said. His voice was professional and not unkind. I counted 3 full seconds. Let my gaze drift past his left shoulder toward the window, toward the middle distance where the magnolias moved in the August heat, before allowing my eyes to wander back to his face and settle there with the mild, pleasant blankness of a woman who has been interrupted mid-reverie. "The judge will be home for tea shortly, won't he, dear?" I said, directing the question at Sam with the specific warm confusion of a woman who has mislaid the present tense. I paused, as if searching, and then, this was the detail I had rehearsed, I fumbled Sam's name. Stephen? Harold's name had been Harold. Sam's father. His middle name had been Stephen, which Sam had inherited as his own middle name and had always disliked. I watched Sam's face as I called him by his dead father's name, and I watched the relief move through him like a tide, the physical loosening of a man who has just confirmed that the threat has been neutralized. He thought I was gone. He thought I was a vacant house with the lights left on. He smiled at Vance with the practiced sorrow of a devoted son. You see what I mean, he said quietly. Vance wrote something on his clipboard. I looked back at the middle distance and breathed slowly and felt the cold satisfaction of a card player who has just induced a false confidence in the person across the table. I let the silence build for perhaps a minute. Vance was completing something on his clipboard. Sam was positioned 3 feet to his left, performing devoted vigilance. Candace had not entered the room. She was better deployed elsewhere, I imagined, smoothing surfaces and creating impressions. Then I leaned toward Vance, slowly, with the careful movement of someone whose balance requires deliberateness. I lowered my voice to a confidential register, the voice of a woman sharing something important that she might lose track of if she speaks too loudly. I can't remember where I put the judge's safe deposit key, I said. I let my eyes go slightly unfocused, as if the memory were water I was trying to hold in cupped hands. The one for the rubies in the floor. There are no rubies. There has never been a safe deposit key for rubies. What there is, what there has always been, is the floor safe, and the original deed, and Harold's specific legal rider. But Sam did not know the contents of that safe. He knew it existed. He did not know what it held. I did not look at him directly. I kept my eyes on the vague middle distance, the portrait of a mind gently misfiring. But I felt the change in the room's atmosphere with the precision of a woman who has spent decades reading a bridge table, the slight intake of breath, the almost imperceptible shift of weight, the sudden heightened attention of a man whose greed has just been activated. Rubies. Liquid, portable, untraceable. Hidden in the floor of a house he was about to control. He didn't just want the house anymore. He wanted whatever I'd been hoarding in my senility. He needed total, unimpeded legal control, and he needed it immediately, and the beautiful part, the part one had calculated carefully, was that I had just handed him a reason to accelerate his own timetable. Sam drew Vance aside with the smooth efficiency of a man who has rehearsed this conversation. I kept my gaze soft and unfocused, my hands draped over the armrests, the perfect portrait of a woman not quite tracking what was happening around her. You see, officer, Sam said, his voice pitched at the just audible level of theatrical discretion. She's living in 1994. Some days are better than others, but, a heavy pause, the pause of a man gathering himself, I've arranged for a notary to come tomorrow. We need the full power of attorney just to keep up with her medical bills. And to secure the estate. For her protection. Vance nodded. His pen moved across the clipboard. He saw a devoted son. A man in over his head, clearly stressed, doing the hard and thankless work of managing a parent's decline. He saw the library, well maintained. He saw the woman in the wingback chair, clean and pressed and pleasantly vague. He did not see the forged deed at the courthouse. He did not see the lorazepam vial behind the English biscuits. He did not see the liquidation ledger on the desk or the amber vial on the kitchen counter or the brass urn that had spent 2 days in a cardboard box labeled junk. He scheduled a follow-up and noted that the family appeared to be providing appropriate care. After he left, Sam stood in the doorway of the library for a moment, looking at me with the expression of a man who has just cleared a significant obstacle. Then he turned and walked toward the kitchen, and I heard him call Candace's name with a new lightness in his voice. The trap was set. Sam was the one standing in it. I heard the scraping before I reached the window. Metal on stone, the sound of something being dragged across the front path, something heavy and protesting the movement. I gripped the bookshelf and covered the distance to the front library window as quickly as my hip allowed, and what I saw in the August afternoon light would have brought me to my knees if I had permitted it. Candace was on the lawn. She had brought out the folding tables from the garage, the ones I had used for the neighborhood Christmas party, white legs and hollow aluminum frames, and draped them with plastic tablecloths in that particular cheap, cheerful pattern you find at party supply stores. Harold's mahogany cases were open on the grass. His leather-bound law books, 40 years of marginal annotations in his specific hand, the cramped, precise script I had watched him develop over decades, The volumes that had traveled with us from the first Buckhead apartment to this house were stacked in uneven piles, their spines facing every direction. Candace lifted one and looked at it with the expression of a person lifting something off the floor of a basement. She set it on a folding table with the kind of efficiency that comes from having no opinion about a thing. My grandmother's sterling silver tea service, the set that had arrived from Savannah in 1922, that had been used for every Christmas, every Easter, every occasion of significance in my family for over a century, was being lifted from its felt-lined box and dropped into a plastic storage bin. I heard the ring of metal against plastic from inside the house. The sound was very small. That was the part that undid me, briefly. That's something a century old, something that had traveled all that way and survived all those years, made such a small sound when it was dropped into a bin. By noon the strangers had arrived. Buckhead on a weekday has a particular demographic for estate sales, a mixture of the genuinely curious, the professional resellers, and the people who are attracted by the possibility of acquiring beautiful things at prices that suggest someone else's misfortune. They came in shorts and tennis shoes, carrying canvas bags and the casual acquisitiveness of a farmer's market visit. I sat at the library window and watched. A man in a University of Georgia cap held Harold's fountain pen collection, 12 pens in a walnut case, including the Mont Blanc Meisterstück Harold had used to sign his first judgment, and negotiated with Candace until she accepted $20. He walked away satisfied. He would probably use one of them to sign grocery lists. A woman in a sun hat picked through my silk scarves, the ones from a trip to Paris Harold had surprised me with for our 30th anniversary, pulling them out of their box one at a time and holding them up against the light before folding them over her arm. I watched each transaction. I made myself watch each one. There is a specific quality to humiliation when it takes the form of a price tag. When someone reduces a piece of your life to a number and another person decides whether that number is worth it. My grandmother's tea service. Harold's pen collection. The Wedgwood china I had used for every Thanksgiving for 22 years. They were being converted, transaction by transaction, from the substance of a life into the raw material of someone else's debt payment. The dust from the displaced books reached me even through the glass. I tasted it in the back of my throat. I turned from the window and gripped the sill without thinking. The pain was immediate and total, a white-hot spike that traveled from my knuckles up through my wrists and into my forearms with the specific, uncompromising quality of inflammation past its threshold. I looked down at my hands. The knuckles were swollen and red, the joints visibly enlarged, the skin stretched tight over the inflammation. I could not make a fist. When I tried, my fingers moved only partway, stopping with a sharp protest that made my eyes water. Tomorrow the notary would come. Tomorrow there would be papers on the dining room table and a witness watching my hands, and if my hands shook or cramped or if I struggled to hold a pen, that struggle would be read, would be documented, as the physical evidence of cognitive incapacity. Sam would lean forward with the practiced concern of a devoted son and say, "See?" And Vance's clipboard entry would be confirmed. I had to get the inflammation down. I needed ice and time and the anti-inflammatory medication that had been in the upstairs bathroom cabinet before Candace had reorganized the bathroom with the thoroughness of someone establishing ownership. I breathed through the pain. I allocated it the same 30 seconds I gave everything I couldn't immediately fix. Then I went to find the ice. The sun dropped below the tree line and the long shadows of the oak trees fell across the dining room floor in patterns that had always meant evening to me. The particular quality of late afternoon light in this room, the way it turned the wood floors amber, was one of the things I had loved about this house for 40 years. The room was stripped. The sideboard that had been in Harold's family since before the Civil War, a piece his mother had refused to sell during the worst of the Depression, was gone. The oil paintings had been pulled from the walls, their hooks still in the plaster, and were leaning against the baseboards with yellow price stickers on the frames, $75. $125. $60. Harold's portrait, which I had commissioned for his retirement from the bench, had a sticker that read $200 per OBO. I stood in the center of the room and felt the floorboards hollow under my feet, the sound of a space that has been emptied of its meaning. I had stood in this room when Harold proposed. I had stood in this room when Sam took his first steps, crossing the Persian rug to reach the chair Harold was sitting in, both of us too stunned to breathe. I had served 40 years of meals in this room, hosted 30 years of Christmas dinners, held 2 wakes in this room for friends who died before they should have. The silence was the loudest thing in the house. For one moment, and I will allow myself this, because it was one moment and one moment only, the weight of all of it pressed down on the steel spine my husband had always admired, and I felt it flex. 72 years old. Alone. My son selling the bed from under me. My husband's portrait marked OBO. I breathed in. I breathed out. I walked back to the kitchen. Sam did not know I was in the hallway. The kitchen light was on, and he was moving with a focused, methodical attention that I had never seen him apply to anything in his adult life, the concentration of a man performing a ceremony that matters very much to him. The silver Earl Grey pot, one of the few things not on the lawn because it was required for tomorrow's performance, sat on the counter, polished to a mirror finish. He had measured the loose-leaf tea already, precise amounts, the care of someone who understands that the presentation must be above suspicion. His eyes kept moving to the amber vial on the counter. Small, pharmaceutical amber, with a white label I was too far away to read from the hallway but had already identified from my earlier reconnaissance. He picked it up, set it down. Picked it up again and held it against the kitchen light, checking the level. Set it down. He was calculating dosage. He was calculating how much would render a 72-year-old woman cooperative and compliant and smilingly uncomprehending without sending her to the hospital, because a woman in the hospital would require medical documentation and medical documentation would introduce complications. He needed me present and conscious and apparently willing. He was planning the murder of my signature. He handled the vial with the careful, precise attention of a man who knows that what he is doing is a crime and has decided that the benefit is worth the categorization. I watched him from the shadows and committed everything to memory. Sam went to the cellar to check the remaining merchandise, the items he hadn't moved to the lawn yet, the boxes of things he was staging for a second round of sales. I heard the cellar door open, the creak of the wooden stairs, the pull of the light chain. I moved. The pantry was 8 steps from where I stood. I covered them slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a body that has already had a very long week, and eased the pantry door open without allowing it to swing past the point where the hinge would speak. The shelves were organized in Candace's system, the reorganization of someone who has taken over a kitchen and arranged it according to their own logic, which meant I had to search. Upper shelf, right side. The expensive English biscuits Sam liked, the tin from the specialty grocer on Peachtree. Behind the tin, the amber vial. I leaned forward, the shelf was high enough that it cost me a small negotiation with my back, and read the label in the pantry's thin light. Lorazepam. The dosage and concentration were printed in the small, dense font of a pharmaceutical label, and I read them twice and committed them accurately. A heavy-duty benzodiazepine. A full vial, or close to it. Enough, and this was not an estimate, this was the considered opinion of a woman who had once maintained a medical reference section for a university library and had never quite stopped reading it, enough to thoroughly sedate a person significantly larger than me. I did not touch it. I did not need to touch it. I only needed to know exactly where it was, exactly what it was, and exactly how much of it there was. I replaced everything. I eased the pantry door back to its original position. I returned to the hallway and walked slowly toward the library before the cellar stairs creaked with Sam's returning weight. Information. The only currency I had left. But I was beginning to think it might be enough. I did not sleep. I lay in the bed in the room that had been mine for 40 years, the room Candace had redecorated by removing everything personal from the surfaces, leaving the bare geometry of the furniture without the life that had filled it, and stared at the ceiling and ran the sequence in my mind the way a musician runs a difficult passage. Not emotionally. Technically. Left 22. Right 14. Left 39. The combination to the floor safe had not changed since Harold had set it, because Harold had chosen a combination based on the dates of 3 specific Superior Court rulings he considered his finest work, and I had committed it to memory the day he showed me the safe, and I had not forgotten it, not once, in the years since his death. The desk over the safe, approximately 250 pounds. I had failed to move it alone. I could not move it alone tomorrow either. My back had made that clear, and my hands had their own opinion on the matter. I needed a different approach to the desk. I needed the desk to not be over the safe at the relevant moment, which meant I needed Sam to move it, which meant I needed Sam to believe he wanted to move it. The cup swap. I had performed this move, the classic, the foundational, the one you learn before you learn anything else, at the bridge table so many times that it had long since ceased to require conscious attention. A swap during the distraction of a deal, during the commotion of a contested hand, during the moment when everyone at the table is looking at the same card. The principle was simple. The execution was in the hands. And my hands tomorrow would need to work. I ran the swap in my mind, slowly, feeling the phantom weight of the cups, the Earl Grey pot, the fine bone china, the specific distance between the cups on the table. I ran it again. I ran it until it was a reflex, until it lived in my hands rather than my head, until I could perform it in the dark without thinking, which was approximately what tomorrow would require. The original deed. Martha Elaine Corley, not Thornton. Harold had insisted on filing it under my maiden name, a precaution, he had said, with the quiet prescience of a man who had spent 30 years watching what people were capable of doing to each other when money was involved. The bloodprint rider. The specific clause requiring biological verification for any transfer. Sam had forged my signature on a quitclaim deed, but a quitclaim deed could only transfer what the grantor actually held, and what my forged signature held was not the original title. I had played through to the end of the game so many times that I knew every outcome. There was one sequence that worked. Only one. And it required that I hold my nerve tomorrow with the completeness of someone who has nothing left to lose except the only thing that matters. The light came before the alarm. I was already awake when the pale Atlanta dawn began to bleed through the curtains, that particular silver-gray quality of an August morning before the heat has fully committed, the sky still uncertain. I sat up and looked at my hands. The inflammation had receded. Not gone, it would never be fully gone, and I had made my peace with that fact 11 years ago, but the white-hot crisis of yesterday had settled back into the familiar dull throb, the background noise of a body that has been keeping its own counsel for over 7 decades. I could close my fingers. The movement was stiff and cost me a wince, but I could close them. I could hold a pen. I dressed deliberately. This was not a casual act. I chose the best wool trousers, the navy, pressed, the crease still holding from before the trip to Serenity Springs. The white silk blouse. The single string of pearls. The Cartier watch on my left wrist, the gold wedding band on my right. I pinned my silver white bob with the 2 pins I kept in the left drawer of the vanity, the ones Harold had given me because he said they caught the light the right way. I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself for a long moment. Not a victim. Not a patient. Not a confused old woman who had signed away her house and lost track of the year. I looked at myself and I saw the widow of a Superior Court judge, a woman who had maintained a legal archive for 31 years, a woman who had outlasted harder things than this with her spine intact. I saw someone who knew exactly what she was about to walk into and had prepared for it with the discipline of someone who understands that preparation is the only form of confidence that holds under pressure. I am the master of my domain, I said to the mirror. Harold would have smiled at that. Not the polite smile. The real one. I picked up the brass urn from the bedside table and carried it to the library, where I set it back on the shelf between the Georgia Law Review and the Blackstone's commentaries, where it had always lived. Then I walked to the dining room and waited for my son to bring me tea. The dining room had never felt so much like a courtroom. I had spent 30 years in rooms adjacent to the law, attending Harold's hearings when the cases were significant, sitting in the gallery of Superior Court on the days when he rendered decisions that would matter, attending the Bar Association dinners where the language of jurisprudence was the social currency. I knew what a room felt like when the weight of a legal proceeding had settled into it. The air becomes specific. The quality of attention changes. People sit differently. The notary had that quality. She was a compact woman in her 50s with the particular rigid efficiency of someone whose professional life consists of witnessing human beings at their most consequential moments, the signing of wills, the transfer of properties, the formal notation of decisions that cannot be undone. She had a heavy seal stamp and an expression of complete professional neutrality. She sat across from Officer Vance, the power of attorney stacked between them like a verdict waiting to be rendered. Sam stood at the head of the table. His face had a thin film of moisture across the forehead and upper lip, the sweat of a man whose body knows something is at stake even while his mind insists he has controlled the variables. He was wearing a suit today. A real one, or close enough, dark charcoal, slightly too warm for August, his attempt to present the image of a man managing a family difficulty with appropriate gravitas. His fingers were on the table and they were drumming. A silent, rapid tattoo on the mahogany. He would not have been aware of it. I entered and took my seat, my spine straight, my hands in my lap. I had worn the pearls. I had pinned my hair correctly. Every detail of my presentation had been assembled this morning with the deliberateness of a woman who understands that appearance is an argument, that how you occupy a room tells people what to believe about you before you've said a single word. I was the fading matriarch. I was the vacant, gentle, overmanaged elderly woman whose affairs had been lovingly assumed by a devoted son. I played the part with the clean technical confidence of someone who has been rehearsing for days and has nothing left to be nervous about. I folded my hands in my lap and waited for the tea. He brought it in on the silver tray. The silver pot had been polished to a mirror finish. I could see the inverted reflection of the chandelier in its surface as Sam carried it through the doorway, the tray held in both hands with the careful, slightly effortful grip of a man carrying something that requires him to look competent. The fine bone china cups rattled very slightly. His hands were not entirely steady. I watched his eyes. They went, immediately and involuntarily, to the cup on the left. The floral china cup with the slightly chipped rim, a chip that had been there for 12 years. Since the Christmas when Sam's then-girlfriend had knocked it against the faucet while helping with the washing up. I had kept it because Harold said the chip gave it character. Sam's gaze touched it and moved away with the studied casualness of a man trying not to look at the thing he is most focused on. He set the tray down and poured. The Earl Grey rose in a fragrant column of steam, bergamot, warm and clean, and under it something else. Something with the faint chemical bitterness of a compound that doesn't belong in tea, the kind of bitter that the bergamot was meant to mask but didn't, not entirely, not to someone who had spent 3 decades in a library that included pharmaceutical reference materials and had been paying close attention to the kitchen counter for the last 24 hours. He placed the chipped cup before me with a hand that trembled slightly. "Drink up, mother," he said. His voice had the quality of sandpaper being used gently, rough underneath the surface care. "It'll settle your nerves for the paperwork." He poured his own cup. Set it to his right. Clean, steaming, untainted Earl Grey. He settled back in his chair with the suppressed satisfaction of a man who believes the game is effectively over, and he looked at the notary and nodded. The notary uncapped her pen. The black ink caught the chandelier light. "Before we begin." Candace's voice came in sharp and practiced, the interruption timed with the precision of something rehearsed. She thrust a thick blue folder across the table toward Officer Vance, her face arranged in an expression of tragic devotion. "These are the latest neurology reports from the clinic. You really should review the scan results before she signs. Given the rate of decline." Vance leaned in, his brow furrowing with the professional concern of a man who takes his responsibility seriously. He opened the folder. The notary leaned sideways to see, a natural reflex, the reflex of any person in a room where documents are being presented as evidence. 3 seconds. Every eye in the room was on the fabricated pages of a manufactured decline. I did not hesitate. I did not think. I had moved past thinking about this 2 nights ago, when I had run it until it was reflex, until it lived in my hands and not my head. My left hand found my cup's handle and my right hand found Sam's, and in one fluid, silent arc, the arc of 40 years of bridge, of 1,000 practiced deceptions in the service of a card game, of the specific, ghostly precision that Harold had always called, your magician's hands, I rotated them. The chipped cup settled in front of Sam's right hand. The clean cup settled in front of mine. I placed both hands back in my lap and let my gaze go soft and neutral just as Vance looked up from the folder. My heart was making its case known, a hard, insistent drumbeat behind my sternum, but my face was the face of a woman watching something happen in a room she is not quite tracking. Right, Sam said. Let's get to it. The relief in his voice was palpable, the relief of a man who has waited through a tense interval and believes the important thing has been accomplished. He reached for his cup. He took a long swallow. Half the cup, in the easy, slightly greedy way of someone who is genuinely looking forward to the sensation of calm settling into his bloodstream, because that was what he was expecting, the calm of a man who is in control, whose plan is proceeding, whose mother is about to sign away everything she owns and whose tea is going to taste exactly like victory. I lifted my own cup and drank. The Earl Grey was good. Harold had always kept a good Earl Grey. I watched Sam over the rim. He smiled at me. The patronizing smile, the pitying smile, the smile of a man looking at a problem he has already solved. His eyes were waiting for my head to begin its descent, for the pharmaceutical fog to roll in behind my eyes, for the vacancy to deepen into the compliance he required. I held his gaze and let him wait. 10 minutes. The notary was explaining Section 4, the language governing healthcare decisions, the clause that would give Sam authority over every medical choice made on my behalf for the remainder of my life. Her voice was precise and even, the voice of a professional who has delivered this explanation many times and does not editorialize. Sam was not listening to Section 4. I watched it happen with the clinical attention of a woman who had been waiting for it. The first sign was the stillness, Sam's fidgeting, the drumming fingers, the slight constant movement of a man held together by nervous energy, simply stopped. His hands went flat on the table. Then his chin dropped a fraction of an inch, and he raised it again with visible effort. His eyelids had acquired a weight they hadn't had before. He tried to sit forward. The movement was wrong, imprecise, the movement of a body whose signals are arriving with a delay. His eyes widened in the way eyes widen when the body registers something alarming, and he put both hands on the table as if to steady himself, and when he tried to stand his knees simply declined to participate. He dropped back into the chair with a sound that was less a decision than a collapse. The lights, he said. His voice was wrong, thick and wet, the consonants losing their edges. He looked at the chandelier as if it had done something unexpected. The lights are. He looked at me. And I let him see it. I stopped performing. I let the steel blue eyes stop being vacant and I looked at him directly, clearly, with the full, unobstructed attention of a woman who is completely present and has been completely present for every moment of the last week, and I watched him understand, in the specific, druggy, syrup-slow way of a man whose blood chemistry is being reorganized, that something had gone wrong with his careful plan. You, he said. And then the word ran out of architecture to hold it. The drug took his filters first. That is the thing about benzodiazepines in high doses, they don't render you unconscious immediately, not a man his size, not in the first 15 minutes. What they do is remove the editorial layer, the self-monitoring function, the part of the human mind that stands between what you feel and what you say. Sam's calculated Southern gentleman veneer, the performed morning sun register, the careful management of every syllable, all of it dissolved, and what was left underneath was the raw, unedited truth of him. He was pointing at me. His arm was having difficulty sustaining the gesture, but the intention was there, the finger aimed, the voice rising with the disinhibited urgency of a man who has been holding something back for a very long time. Had to do it. His voice filled the stripped dining room, too loud, the volume of a man who has lost proprioception. The crypto-bleed, it was eating me alive. You don't know what it's like to watch everything, he laughed, and the laugh was the most honest thing I had ever heard from him, which is to say it was terrifying, high and jagged and without any warmth at all. I forged it. Every damn line. I had a light box, traced it off your thank you notes, the ones you keep in the secretary drawer. Candace said his name. Once, twice. Her face had gone the color of old paper. You were just sitting there. Sam continued, past her, past all of them, past whatever social contract had held him together for 48 years. A ghost in a big house. All that money and all that, just sitting there in your library with his ashes. He tried to stand again and this time managed approximately 4 inches before gravity finished the argument. I handled it, he said, with the sudden, quiet satisfaction of a man reaching the end of a long justification. I handled it. Candace put her hands over her face. The notary had withdrawn her seal stamp from the table and was holding it in her lap with the expression of a woman who has witnessed many things in the performance of her professional duties and is revising her sense of what constitutes unusual. Officer Vance had not moved from his chair. He had not said a word, had not reached for Sam, had not intervened in any of it. He had reached, quietly and without announcement, into the breast pocket of his off-the-rack but well-pressed suit jacket, and placed a small digital recorder on the table. The red light was on. Had been on, I understood, for some time. He looked at Sam with the particular expression of a man whose professional assessment has been comprehensively confirmed, and then he looked at me, not with pity, not with the clinical detachment of an officer managing a case, but with something closer to recognition. Mrs. Thornton, he said. Is there something you need to show me? Sam's chin hit the mahogany table with the sound of a problem resolving itself. I stood up. The adrenaline was doing what adrenaline does, a roar that temporarily reorganized the body's priorities, pushed the osteoarthritis into the background where it belonged, clarified the distance between where I was and where I needed to be into something simple and traversable. I walked into the library. I heard Candace's footsteps behind me, not purposeful, not threatening, the stumbling footsteps of a woman in shock moving because standing still was no longer an option, and I did not look back at her. I reached the desk. The same desk. Glass and steel. The same 250 pounds that had defeated me 4 days ago when my body was operating alone under duress. I looked at it for exactly as long as it took me to position my feet, shoulder width, weight forward, the posture not of a librarian but of a woman who has been gardening and carrying her own groceries and refusing to be considered fragile for the better part of a decade. I planted both hands against the frame and pushed. My knuckles screamed. My lower back filed the same objection it had filed on my previous attempt. I acknowledged both protests with the respect they deserved, which was none, not right now, and I drove my weight forward and the desk groaned and the steel legs dragged against the library floor with a sound like something enormous giving way, and it moved. 6 inches. 8. Enough. The Persian rug. I dropped to my knees, my patellas were not pleased, but they were outvoted, and took the edge of the rug in both hands and pulled it back. The trapdoor was exactly where Harold had shown me, in 1994, the day after the contractor had finished, and he had stood in this room with his hand on my shoulder and said, "Just in case, Martha, just in case," and the handle was cold and familiar against my palm and the door swung up without difficulty, because Harold had kept the hinges oiled and I had kept the hinges oiled after him, because that is what you do with things you intend to be able to use. The dial was cold under my fingers. Left 22. The library was quiet except for the sound of Candace somewhere behind me, making a sound that might have been crying or might have been something beyond crying, a sound past the point where it has a name. Officer Vance had entered the room. I heard his footsteps stop at a respectful distance. Right 14. I thought about Harold drafting the writer. I thought about his law clerk, a young man named Davis, sharp and well-intentioned, who had told Harold with polite bewilderment that the bloodprint requirement was an anachronism, that it had no modern legal precedent, that it would only complicate any future transfer. I thought about Harold listening carefully and then saying, with the specific, quiet authority of a man who has spent 30 years watching what people do to each other, leave it in. Left 39. The lock released with a click that was, in my subjective experience of that moment, approximately the most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my life. The steel door swung open. The safe's interior was cool and dark and smelled of the cedar lining Harold had specified. Inside, wrapped in the vellum I had placed it in years ago, was a single document. I lifted it out. I stood, slowly, because the adrenaline was beginning its recession and the osteoarthritis was reasserting its position in the hierarchy, and I turned around. Vance was standing at the edge of the rug. I unwrapped the vellum and held the document out to him. The original deed. The paper was heavy stock, the ink crisp, the filing date clear, 1981. Under the name of the grantee, Martha Elaine Corley. Read the writer, officer, I said. My voice. My actual voice, not the thin, wavering, carefully manufactured voice of the woman who had been living in this house for the last week, but the voice I had used for 30 years of faculty meetings and research consultations and board presentations, the voice Harold had said could silence a room without raising itself. It had come back to me without effort, like a thing that had simply been waiting. My husband knew Sam's nature, I said. This property requires a bloodprint verification for any legal transfer. A detail my son's forgery couldn't account for, because the quitclaim deed Sam filed doesn't transfer a title that was never in the grantor's name to begin with. Vance read the writer. He read it twice. He looked up at me. I'll need to make some calls, he said. Of course, I said. Use the landline in the foyer. My son cut the exterior line, but the interior junction is intact. I paused. He didn't know about the secondary conduit. Harold had it installed in 1989 when we had the security system upgraded. It's behind the hall closet. Vance looked at me for a moment longer than was strictly professional. Then he nodded and went to make his calls. The lights came through the library windows in pulses. Blue and red, the colors of consequence, washing across the leather spines of Harold's law books in slow, rhythmic sweeps that turned the room into something that felt, briefly, like a vigil. I stood in the foyer and watched through the sidelight window. 2 deputies from the sheriff's department. They were not unkind about it, this I will say in fairness, because fairness is a discipline, not a feeling. They handled Sam's considerable deadweight with the practiced efficiency of men who have managed uncooperative bodies before. He was still talking, slurring, loose, the confession continuing to unspool in the druggy, disinhibited way it had been going for 20 minutes, something about Bitcoin futures and the old woman, and a figure in the high 6 digits that I suspected was the amount he'd already borrowed against the forged deed before its recording could be challenged. They cuffed him in the chair and helped him to the vehicle with a kind of resigned professionalism. Elder abuse. Felony fraud. Forgery. The charges, when Vance read them, had the satisfying specificity of things that have been carefully earned. Candace came out next. Her neon pink heels, the ones I had watched swinging from my Louis XIV settee on the afternoon I arrived home, clicked on the limestone path with a frantic, staccato rhythm entirely out of keeping with the measured pace at which the deputy was escorting her. She had the emergency eviction notice in her hand and she was reading it with the expression of a person whose understanding of their situation is updating in real time. She looked up once, toward the house, toward the window where I was standing, and I did not look away. She looked away first. The Ford Explorer pulled out of the driveway and the crunch of gravel, the same gravel that had announced Vance's arrival this morning, the same gravel that had signaled the shift of every consequential thing today, receded down the drive and onto the street and was gone. The blue and red lights extinguished themselves. The Buckhead silence returned. It was the sweetest silence I had heard in a very long time. The sun was going down over Atlanta. I stood on my porch, my limestone, my magnolias, and watched it go. The light came in low and gold the way it does in August, the particular Atlanta August light that I have never been able to adequately describe to people who haven't seen it, the light that turns everything warm and slightly unreal for about 30 minutes before the dark comes in. The neighbor's sprinklers had come on across the street. A mockingbird was making its evening inventory of the sounds it had collected during the day. The cardboard box labeled junk was in the custody of the sheriff's department. Evidence. I had watched a deputy carry it to the evidence vehicle with a care that struck me as quietly appropriate, the care one takes with something that turns out to matter more than it appeared. I went inside and closed the heavy oak door behind me. The bolt was a satisfying sound. Definitive. Mechanical. The sound of a thing restored to its proper state. I went to the keypad by the door, the one Sam had known the code to, the one Candace had been using for a week as if it were her own, and I cleared it. I thought for a moment. I entered a 6-digit sequence, the month and year of Harold's first Superior Court appointment, the date we had celebrated with a dinner at the restaurant on Peachtree where they always remembered his order, the date he had come home and said, "Martha, we made it," with the particular quiet happiness of a man who measures things by whether they are worth having. Nobody else knew that date. Nobody else had been in the car with us that night, or at the dinner, or at home afterward when he'd poured 2 glasses of sherry and said to the law, then, and I'd said to us. The keypad confirmed the new code with a small, satisfied beep. I went to the library. Harold's law books were on the shelves where they had always been, not all of them, not the ones that had gone to the lawn, not the volumes that were now in the canvas bags of strangers who did not know what they were carrying. That was a grief I would attend to later, quietly and specifically. The collection could be reconstructed, if not completely then substantially, and I knew the rare book dealers in this city the way I knew my own hallways. The brass urn was on its shelf. Between the Georgia Law Review and the Blackstone's commentaries, where it belonged. I touched the urn briefly, the way you touch something to confirm it is still there, the way you touch a thing you love. The decanter on the library table held the sherry, not the 1945, which was gone, but a bottle I had kept in the cellar for reasons I had now forgotten, an older purchase, a decent Amontillado that Harold had always said was underrated as a category. I poured a single glass. The amber of it caught the last of the August light through the library windows and held it for a moment, warm and specific, before the light moved on. I sat in the wingback chair. The house was quiet. Not the dead quiet of the last week, the silence of a place that has been hollowed out, but the living quiet of a house that is itself again, holding its history in its walls and its floorboards and the smell of old leather and floor wax that Candace's lily perfume had temporarily displaced and which had, I noticed, begun already to reassert itself. The Persian rug was back over the trapdoor. I had replaced it myself, the way you replace a thing that has been used and should be returned to order. The deed was with Vance, who had given me his direct number and said he would be in touch tomorrow with the particulars of the legal situation, which I understood to mean that there was a great deal of paperwork ahead and that the paperwork would ultimately confirm what the deed already established, that the house had never, in any legal sense, belonged to anyone but Martha Elaine Corley Thornton, and that the recording at the courthouse had been executed on a forged instrument and would be vacated accordingly. I was not worried about the paperwork. I had spent 31 years in a legal archive. I would manage the paperwork the way I managed everything, methodically, completely, and without fuss. I held the sherry glass in both hands, my arthritic, swollen, triumphant hands, and I sat in my library in the deepening Atlanta evening and I thought about nothing in particular for a little while. I thought about Harold, briefly. Not with grief, exactly, or not only with grief. With the specific feeling of having done something he would have understood. He had been, above all things, a man who believed that the law meant something, not as an abstraction but as a practice, as a daily discipline, as the specific and effortful work of building a world where things could not simply be taken because the taker was stronger. He had spent 30 years on a bench making that case in the particular, painstaking way of jurisprudence, one ruling at a time. He had also, it turned out, spent some of that time thinking about his son. Just in case, Martha. Just in case. I raised my glass to the brass urn. Then I set it down, took a notepad from the library table, and began to write a letter to Evelyn Marsh. Not a dramatic letter, I had no interest in drama at this point in the evening. A straightforward letter, explaining that the reports of my cognitive decline had been somewhat exaggerated, that I was feeling quite well, and that I hoped she would be available for bridge on Thursday. I mentioned that Pearl was looking healthy and that I had always liked that dog despite the name. The copperplate cursive came easily, as it always did. The loops of the letters even, the pressure consistent, the baseline straight. My handwriting. Nobody else's. I signed it, folded it, and set it on the desk to mail in the morning. Outside, the last light left the sky over Buckhead. The mockingbird finished its evening performance and went quiet. The grandfather clock in the foyer marked the hour with its deep, unhurried chime, the sound of time continuing, of the house keeping its own account. I am Martha Thornton. I am the widow of a Superior Court judge. I spent 31 years as a librarian and I never threw away a document worth keeping. I am 72 years old and my hands hurt and my library is not yet complete and there is a great deal of work still to be done. I am the master of my domain. And I have all the time I need. If you made it to this moment, thank you for listening all the way through. Most people bail before the bill comes due. But here, the bill always comes due. What started as humiliation and disrespect ended with receipts, truth, and a payoff they never saw coming. If you want more stories where karma shows up without mercy, hit subscribe and come back for the next one. Now tell me in the comments, what was the most disgusting thing they did? What crossed the line for you?